August 11th, 1945. The 6th day of the New World. Imagine silence. Not the silence between two notes in a symphony or in a forest before dawn. No. This was an absolute deafening silence, the silence of space that had fallen upon a dead planet. The air, thick with a fine ubiquitous ash, did not stir. It stood still, as if the world itself had congealed. There is no life in this air. No birdsong, no chirp of cicadas, no distant hum of engines or human voices. There is only a rustle, barely discernible, rhythmic, strange. It is the rustle of dozens of bare feet stepping on a carpet of gray dust that has covered everything that was once the city of Hiroshima. In the middle of an endless field of ruins where the molten skeletons of buildings reach for a whitish, indifferent sky, a formation moves. 12 figures in torn, blackened school uniforms. 12 girls. Their faces are masks of soot and caked-on grime, through which an unnatural pallor of the skin shows. Their eyes are empty and bottomless, like wells reflecting only ash. They do not cry. They do not speak. They march in step. Ahead of them, like a grim sentinel, strides a woman, Overseer Matsuda. Her face is a mask carved from granite, her back as straight as a steel rod. In her hand is not a weapon, not a flask of water. In her hand is a stopwatch taken from a factory machine. She is not measuring time. She is measuring survival. Every 50 steps, she raises her hand. The formation freezes. Every 50 steps, they synchronously turn their heads left, then right. This is not a search for help. This is a training drill for locating security breaches on the territory, punctually performed in the middle of the apocalypse. They are not surviving. They are executing regulations. Their movements are mechanical. Their obedience absolute. They are a broken mechanism that continues to work by inertia in a world where all other mechanisms have turned to rust and dust. These are not people escaping the end of the world. These are the ghosts of a factory emerged from underground, continuing their shift in hell. Their eyes are empty, but in the depths of this emptiness, it is not hope that smolders. It is discipline. A cold, ruthless, inhuman discipline hammered into them by months of drills at a military plant. It was this, not the will to live, not love or faith, that became their only shield against madness, despair, and the invisible death dissolved in the very air. They do not yet know that their story will never make it into the official chronicles. It will be deemed too strange, too inconvenient, too insane. It will turn into a whisper, an urban legend about the factory girls who built order in the ashes of Hiroshima. But to understand how children turned into unfeeling automatons surviving by a stopwatch, we must go back 6 days, to that final moment when an ordinary living sun still shone over their city, to the moment when their world still existed. August 6th, 1945, 7 o'clock in the morning. The air in Hiroshima was already heavy and sticky, like hot syrup. The summer that year had been unbearably stuffy, and even at dawn, it felt as though you were breathing not air, but steam from a giant cauldron. The assembly workshop of the Mitsubishi military factory was saturated with this heat, mixed with the acrid smell of incandescent metal, machine oil, and the sweat of hundreds of human bodies. For the girls of the Labor Front Mobilization Brigade, this smell had long become their second air. They didn't notice it, just as one doesn't notice the rush of one's own blood. 24 schoolgirls aged 13 to 16, dressed in identical dark blue sailor uniforms and skirts, stood in neat ranks before a line of assembly machines. Their peaceful school life, calligraphy lessons, laughter during breaks, dreams of the future, all that remained in another, almost forgotten existence. Now their world was this humming, grease-stenched basement workshop where they spent their days polishing parts for aerial torpedoes, tiny cogs in the vast, relentless war machine of the Empire. Overseer Matsuda, a woman of about 40 with a face frozen in a perpetual mask of stern exhaustion, walked along the ranks. The clatter of her wooden sandals on the concrete floor was the only sound that cut through the monotonous roar of the machines. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her gaze was sharper than any shout. It found an untucked strand of hair, a slightly crookedly tied neckerchief, a barely perceptible glaze of dreaminess in the eyes. Every gesture of hers was measured and precise, like the movement of a factory press. She was not a person, but the personification of order, discipline, regulation. The girls feared her, but this fear was mixed with a strange, almost filial respect. In a world where everything was collapsing, where fathers and brothers disappeared at the front and mothers wept silently over death notices, her iron, unchanging severity was the only island of stability. She was a rock. Among them was Akiko, a quiet, inconspicuous girl with huge, serious eyes. She didn't just do her job, she worshipped it. Each polished part was not just a piece of metal to her, but a small prayer for the Emperor's victory. She knew all the instructions, all the paragraphs of the factory charter, all the alarm signals by heart. Order was her religion. Beside her stood Hanako, her complete opposite. She looked not at the machine, but somewhere into the distance, beyond the damp concrete walls. There was a distraction in her movements, and a barely noticeable smile hid in the corners of her lips. She dreamed of how the war would end, how she would once again wear a beautiful kimono and go to the Cherry Blossom Festival. This dreaminess was her shield against the suffocating reality. And there was Emi, the eldest and most sensible of them. She held no illusions like Hanako, nor was she a fanatic for discipline like Akiko. She simply did what had to be done. Her pragmatism was her way of survival. The war was a job that had to be worked, so that one day she could return to life. And little Yuki, the youngest and most fragile, who was afraid of loud noises and often cried at night, missing her mother. She tried her best, but her thin fingers barely managed the heavy parts. Every morning began the same. Formation, roll call, briefing. Matsuda-san spoke of the importance of their labor, of the honor of serving the emperor, of the need to be vigilant. Her words were dry and official, but the girls listened with bated breath. This was their gospel. That morning everything proceeded as usual, but something else hung in the air, besides the heat and the smell of oil. An inexplicable, quiet anxiety. The previous evening, American planes had flown over the city again, but they hadn't dropped any bombs. They seemed to be studying something, aiming. There were talks that the war would soon be over, that the Americans were exhausted. But this silence in the sky was more terrifying than any siren's wail. 8:15 in the morning. The factory whistles sang the start of the work shift. The girls dispersed to their stations. Grinding wheels shrieked, presses thundered. The workshop plunged into its usual deafening rhythm. Hanako, as usual, was momentarily distracted. Her gaze slid upward to the small barred window near the ceiling. Through it, only a tiny square of bright blue, cloudless sky was visible. And in that square, she saw a dot. A shiny, silvery dot floating leisurely high above. Just one. She didn't know that this plane had already entered history under the name Enola Gay. She didn't know that little boy slept in its belly. To her, it was just a beautiful, lonely spark in the morning sky. She smiled at it, not realizing she was smiling at her own death. And in that instant, the world vanished. There was no explosion. At least, not at first. There was light. Not sunlight, not lamplight. It was a light that should not exist in the universe. A white, absolute, unbearable light that flooded the small basement window not as a stream, but as a solid, tangible wall. It was denser than steel, hotter than the sun. It bleached the sky, turning it into a blinding void. For one single instant that lasted an eternity, the entire basement workshop was cast in X-ray tones. The girls saw the bones in their own hands, visible through their flesh like a terrible photographic negative. They saw the rebar inside the concrete columns. For a second, the entire world showed them its skeleton, its innermost essence. And then the light went out. and silence fell. Absolute, too. All the sounds of the world, the roar of machines, the hum of the factory, the distant cries of the streets, everything was erased, annihilated by that soundless flash. A second, 2, 3. In that unnatural, vacuum-like silence, they managed to turn to each other with a silent question in their horror-widened eyes. What was that? And then came the sound, and the shockwave. It was something more than a roar. It was a tremor of being itself. The ground beneath their feet bucked like the deck of a sinking ship. The air compressed into a hard, invisible fist, and struck. It struck so hard that it knocked the breath from their lungs, plugged their ears with a cottony silence, and threw their frail bodies like rag dolls. Machines weighing several tons were torn from their mountings and slid across the concrete floor, screeching and grinding everything in their path. Plaster, then chunks of concrete, rained down from the ceiling. The basement, their fortress, their prison began to fold like a house of cards. The lamps went out. The world plunged into pitch darkness, filled with the roar of a collapsing world, the shriek of tearing metal, and the thin, desperate screams of the girls. It was chaos. Primordial. Absolute chaos. It had no meaning, no logic. There was only pain, fear, and darkness. Someone screamed their mother's name. Someone sobbed silently, curled into a ball on the floor. Someone sat in a stupor, unable to move, as shards of rebar shattered near their head. The instincts that should have screamed, "Run!" were silent because there was nowhere to run. They were buried alive. Overseer Matsuda lay on the floor, stunned, covered in dust and small fragments. A high, thin ringing filled her ears. The world spun. For a moment she gave in to panic. In her soul, as in the souls of these children, a primal terror screamed. She wanted to close her eyes and disappear. But then, through the dust and darkness, her fingers found a familiar cold object on a cord around her neck. A metal whistle. A common factory whistle for giving signals. In that moment, it seemed to her an anchor. The last connection to a world where rules and order existed. Her hand tightened on it. She didn't yet know what had happened. She didn't know that the city of Hiroshima was gone. She knew only one thing. An emergency situation had occurred, and for an emergency situation, there is an instruction. Paragraph 7, subpoint B. In the event of a collapse or loss of lighting, maintain calm, remain in place, and await instructions from the shift supervisor. She was the shift supervisor, and she had to give instructions. Overcoming the pain and dizziness, she sat up, dust gritted between her teeth. The air was hot and acrid. Moans and cries surrounded her. Chaos wanted to swallow her, to dissolve her will in the general despair. But she looked at her trembling hands, then at the whistle clutched in them, and in that moment she realized, if they wanted to survive, she had to become more than just an overseer for them. She had to become the factory itself, its iron will, its relentless order. And she raised the whistle to her lips. The first hours after the collapse blurred into a viscous, nightmarish dream woven from darkness, dust, and fear. Time stopped. It felt as if an eternity had passed before the last echoes of the rumbling subsided, and an almost absolute silence settled in the basement, broken only by the quiet weeping and moans of the injured. The air was so thick with cement dust that every breath burned the lungs, triggering fits of dry, tearing coughs. Visibility was zero. Each of the girls was alone in her own personal hell, surrounded by impenetrable gloom and the certainty that she was the only one left alive. Panic, like a cold, clammy fog, seeped into every cell of their bodies, paralyzing their will. It seemed there was no escape, that this concrete tomb was their final resting place. And at that moment, when despair was ready to swallow them whole, a sound cut through. Shrill, sharp, familiar to the point of trembling knees. The whistle. The sound that meant the start and end of a shift, formation, a training drill, the sound of order, the sound of Matsuda-san. It sliced through the darkness and chaos like a surgeon's scalpel. The crying momentarily ceased. The girls froze, listening. The whistle blew again, and again. 3 short, commanding blasts. Attention all. Assemble. It was madness, assembling in pitch darkness amidst the rubble. But it was a familiar, habitual madness, and it proved stronger than the madness of the unknown. Roll call! Matsuda's firm, though hoarse voice rang out in the dark. There was no fear in it. There was steel. And that voice had a sobering effect. It brought them back from oblivion into a cruel but understandable reality. Akiko Tanaka! Matsuda shouted. A quiet, frightened sob was heard in the silence, and then a trembling voice. Here. Hanako Sato. Silence. Hanako Sato. Answer. A metallic clang entered Matsuda's voice. I'm here, someone whispered very close by. And so it went, down the list. Each name called, each trembling response was a small victory over the darkness, a small step from chaos toward order. Out of 24, 18 answered. 6 names were lost to the silence. Matsuda paused, mentally noting the losses as one would note defects in production. No emotion, just a statement of fact. Are there any injured? She asked into the darkness. A chorus of groans and whimpers was her answer. Someone had a broken arm, someone a badly bruised head. Almost all were covered in bruises and scrapes. Everyone remain in place. Do not move. Await instructions, Matsuda commanded. And they obeyed. The habit of obedience hammered in for months proved stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. They sat and waited. Matsuda, fighting through the pain in her bruised shoulder, began to act. She knew this basement like the back of her hand. She knew where the tool cabinet was, where the first aid kit was, where the emergency box with flashlights and batteries was. By feel, stumbling over debris, she reached the right spot. The cabinet door was jammed. For several minutes she tried to open it, but in vain. Then she found a piece of rebar and used it as a lever. With a screech, the door gave way. Inside was a flashlight. With trembling hands, she switched it on. A thin, weak beam snatched a surreal picture from the darkness. The workshop was unrecognizable. It looked like a cave after an earthquake. Machines lay jumbled with chunks of concrete and scraps of wire hung from the ceiling. The air was gray with dust. And amidst this destruction sat her girls, frightened, tear-stained, covered in blood and grime, but they sat in their places and waited. They had not succumbed to panic. They were waiting for an order. At that moment, Matsuda realized they had a chance. A slim, ghostly chance. But a chance, nonetheless. She found the first aid kit and began to attend to the injured. Her actions were mechanical and polished. Clean the wound, apply a bandage. She did not comfort, did not pity. She was performing a task. When the first aid was done, she conducted a second briefing. She divided everyone into 3 squads. The first squad, composed of the healthiest, under the leadership of the pragmatic Emi, was to try to clear the rubble at the main exit. The second, under the command of the meticulous Akiko, was to conduct an inventory of everything that had survived. Tools, water, food, medical supplies. The third squad, consisting of the wounded, was to remain in place, conserving their strength. No one objected. No one questioned. An order had been given, and it had to be carried out. They began to work in near total darkness, illuminated by the dim beam of a single flashlight. Gradually the panic receded, replaced by heavy, monotonous work. Clearing rubble, counting bandages and nuts, all of this brought a semblance of meaning to their shattered world. But by the end of the first day, it became clear that their main enemy was not the rubble. Akiko's squad reported the results of the inventory. They had several emergency rations of dry biscuits and 1 20-liter bottle, about 5 gallons, of drinking water. Half of it was already empty. With strict rationing, the water would last for 2, maybe 3 days. And there was another problem: air. The ventilation system was destroyed. With each passing hour, breathing became more difficult. Oxygen was slowly but surely burning out, replaced by carbon dioxide. They were in a sealed trap, awaiting a slow death by suffocation. It seemed all was lost. But just then, quiet Akiko, who had been silently sorting through factory instructions, looked up at Matsuda. There was no despair in her eyes. There was a thought. "Matsuda-san," she whispered. "Paragraph 12, fire safety. There's an emergency water reservoir in the workshop for the fire suppression system, 150 liters, technical water. But it's water." Akiko's idea was both a salvation and madness. Firstly, the emergency tank was in the farthest corner of the workshop, buried under an especially large pile of rubble. Reaching it meant hours of work clearing heavy concrete slabs and twisted metal. Secondly, and most importantly, the water in it was technical water, not intended for drinking. Using it for anything other than extinguishing a fire was strictly forbidden by the factory charter. Violating this rule was punishable by immediate dismissal and disgrace. For girls raised in a culture of unquestioning obedience, the very thought of deliberately breaking a regulation was almost sacrilegious. But Matsuda was not looking at the charter. She was looking at the cracked lips of her charges, at their sunken eyes where the fever of dehydration was already beginning to smolder. She realized that the rules of the old world no longer applied here. To survive, they would have to create their own. "Emi squad, cease work at the main exit. All efforts to clear the rubble at the reservoir. Akiko, you will show the exact location." Her voice did not waver. She had made a decision to break the rules to save lives. This was her personal Rubicon. From that moment on, she was not just an overseer. She was a leader, the lawgiver of a new underground world. The work resumed with new vigor. Now they had a goal, not an abstract salvation, but a concrete, tangible task: to get to the water. They worked in shifts, which Matsuda established by her watch. 2 hours of work, 1 hour of rest. This helped conserve strength and oxygen. They passed pieces of concrete to each other, bent rebar, clearing meter by meter. Their hands were raw and bleeding, their backs ached with strain, but they continued. Emi directed it all. Her pragmatic mind found the most effective ways to move this or that piece of debris, using crowbars as levers in their own body weight. She didn't give orders. She advised, and her advice was followed without question. She became Matsuda's silent ally, a genius of engineering ingenuity. After almost a full day of continuous work, they reached their goal. The metal tank, embedded in the wall, was dented but intact. All that remained was to open the valve, but it wouldn't budge. Rust and impact deformation had seized it shut. It seemed all their efforts had been in vain. Despair began to creep back into their throats. But then, Akiko intervened again. She remembered another paragraph of the instructions. In case of a jammed valve, use the special key with an extended lever stored on the fire shield. The fire shield was nearby and it had survived. The key was in its place. It felt like a miracle. With the key and the combined efforts of 3 girls, the valve slowly, screechingly gave way. And from the tap, a thin, rusty trickle began to flow. Water. Dirty, with a metallic taste. But it was water. They stared at it as if it were a sacred spring. No one rushed to drink. They waited for Matsuda's permission. She came over, cupped the water in her hands, sniffed it, tasted it. "It's drinkable," she delivered her verdict. "But 1 sip, every 3 hours. Akiko, you are in charge of distribution." This was their first real victory. A victory not over the rubble, but over chaos itself. They had proven to themselves that order and knowledge of silly, boring instructions, could save lives. This success breathed new hope into them. It seemed now that they could do anything. They had learned to survive in the dark. But at that very moment, as they celebrated their small victory, an invisible enemy, far more terrifying than thirst and hunger, had already begun its destructive work inside their bodies. Little Yuki was the first to feel it. She was sitting aside, hugging her knees, and suddenly said in a quiet, surprised voice, "Strange. I have a taste of iron in my mouth, like I licked a coin." No one paid any attention. They didn't yet know that this metallic taste was the first sinister greeting of radiation sickness. The first kiss of the invisible death they had inhaled with the dust in those very first minutes after the flash. Their victory over thirst was merely a brief respite before the main battle. After solving the water problem, life in the underground shelter settled into a harsh but predictable rhythm. Matsuda, like a brilliant engineer, constructed a system out of chaos. She created her own small subterranean empire, living by the laws of the factory. Each day began and ended with a formation and roll call. This ritual was important not for accounting but for psychological stability. It reminded them that they were not just a handful of survivors, but a unit, a brigade, a single organism. The day was divided into 3 8-hour shifts, just like in production. The first shift, the shock brigade under Emi's leadership, continued to methodically clear the rubble at the main exit. The work was slow, almost hopeless, but the process itself was more important than the result. It gave them a sense of struggle, a feeling that they were not passively awaiting death, but actively fighting their way to salvation. The second shift, the supply brigade led by Akiko, was responsible for the life support of their small state. They filtered the water through rags to clean it of rust. They strictly distributed the meager food supplies by the clock, 2 biscuits per person per day. Akiko kept a strict record of everything in an old accounting ledger she found in the ruins of the office. She recorded every bandage issued, every sip of water, every biscuit. This absurd bookkeeping was her way of fighting madness. The third shift was the rest shift, but it was not rest in the usual sense. Matsuda forbade idle talk and reminiscing about the past. This, in her opinion, relaxed discipline and led to despair. Instead, she made the girls clean and sort the surviving tools, braid each other's hair to maintain a tidy appearance, and even recite paragraphs of the factory charter by heart. It was something like a prayer, a mantra that drove away terrible thoughts. Matsuda herself hardly slept. She was the brain and heart of this system. She made rounds of her domain, checking the work of each brigade, resolving minor disputes, encouraging the tired not with a kind word but with a stern look that said, "Work, do not give up." She became more than an overseer to them. She became their deity, stern, demanding, but just. They no longer thought about what was happening on the surface. Their world had shrunk to these damp, dark walls. The basement became their universe, and its laws, the only ones possible. This routine, this mechanical, emotionless work, saved them from themselves. It gave them no time to think about their families, their ruined homes, their lost future. It turned them into parts of a single mechanism where personal grief was irrelevant. Only sometimes during the rest shift, the dreamy Hanako would sit in the darkest corner and quietly hum an old lullaby. Her thin, sad voice would drift through the basement, and in those moments, it seemed the iron armor of discipline would crack, and ordinary human sorrow would break through. But Matsuda would immediately approach and place a hand on her shoulder. "Enough, Sato. This is not the time for songs. It's your turn to check the condition of the wounded's bandages." And Hanako would fall silent, obediently rising. On the 4th day, something happened. Emi's squad, clearing the rubble, came across a breach leading to an adjacent room, the food storage warehouse. Most of the warehouse was destroyed, but in the farthest corner, under a pile of cement sacks, they found several crates of canned food and a bag of rice. It was a true treasure. It meant they could hold out for several more weeks, perhaps even a month. But instead of joy, this discovery brought the first serious discord. Some of the girls, tormented by hunger, began to demand they be given a whole can of food immediately. They shouted that they deserved it, that they could no longer eat dry biscuits. The air smelled of mutiny, but Matsuda remained impassive. She stood before the crowd and said calmly, "The nutritional norms remain the same. 2 biscuits and 50 grams of rice per day. The canned food is a strategic reserve. It will be opened only on my order." Her calmness and iron confidence had an effect. The murmuring ceased. They obeyed again. Matsuda's authority was definitively established. She had proven that even in the face of abundance, order was paramount. On the 5th day, the work at the main exit finally yielded a result. Pushing aside a particularly large piece of concrete slab, the girls saw a gap. A thin strip of gray, dim light broke through the crack. It was light from the surface, light from another world. They stared at it, mesmerized. Forgotten daylight. At first there was euphoria. They shouted with joy, hugged each other. They were saved. But then, as they widened the passage and began to climb out one by one, their joy gave way first to bewilderment, and then to a quiet, soul-chilling horror. The world they had known no longer existed. They emerged onto the surface one by one, like frightened moles crawling out of a burrow onto a sun-scorched field. Emmy was the first out. She fell to her knees, squinting in the unfamiliar gray light, and froze. Akiko came up behind her, then Hanako, then the rest. Last, like a captain abandoning a sinking ship, Matsuda emerged from the underground. They stood in the middle of what, just 5 days ago, had been a thriving industrial district of Hiroshima, and were silent. Silent because there were no words in the human language capable of describing what they saw. These were not ruins. Ruins are the remains of something. Here, nothing remained. To the very horizon stretched an endless flat desert covered with a smooth layer of gray ash. From this ash, like rotten teeth, jutted the solitary charred skeletons of concrete buildings. Not a single tree, not a single blade of grass. Everything that could burn had burned. Everything that could live had died. The sky was covered by a dense, uniform gray veil through which a dim, lifeless light seeped, casting no shadows. The air was still and heavy. It smelled of bitter soot and something else, elusively sweet, nauseating. And the silence. That same dead, absolute silence they had heard in the first moments underground. Only here, it was infinite. They stood on a hill of broken bricks and looked at their dead city. Akiko tried to find familiar landmarks, the temple spire, the school roof, the bridge over the river, but there was nothing. Everything was erased. Her meticulous, orderly world where every object had its place had finally collapsed. In its place was only gray emptiness. But the most terrifying thing was not the ruins. The most terrifying thing was the shadows. On the surviving walls, on the steps, on the asphalt were dark silhouettes. The silhouette of a person sitting on the steps. The silhouette of a cyclist. The silhouette of a mother with a child in her arms. As if a flash of incredible power had vaporized the people themselves, leaving only their shadows forever imprinted in stone. These were the last moments of an entire city's life, captured in eternity. The sight was sickening. Hanako fell to her knees. Her dreamy, poetic world, filled with blooming sakura and beautiful kimonos, had been incinerated. Reality was so monstrous that her mind refused to accept it. She began to laugh, a quiet, hysterical laugh. "Order," she whispered, rocking back and forth. "Shifts. Schedule. What's the point? We're all dead. We're just ghosts who haven't realized we're dead yet." Her laughter, like a contagion, began to spread. The other girls, who until then had been holding on by discipline alone, faltered. The same primal horror that Matsuda had so brutally suppressed all these days appeared in their eyes. Their underground empire of order, so strong in the darkness, crumbled to dust under the gray light of a dead sun. "Quiet, Sato," Matsuda said sharply. But Hanako didn't hear her. She jumped to her feet and ran, aimlessly wherever her eyes took her, across this ashen field. "I don't want to! I won't! Let me go!" she screamed. Her panic was infectious. Another girl started crying and also wanted to bolt. Matsuda knew this was the critical moment. If she lost control now, they would all scatter across this radioactive wasteland and perish one by one from madness, hunger, or the invisible sickness. She had to act, swiftly and brutally. She caught up to Hanako in a few leaps, grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her violently. "Get a hold of yourself, Private Sato," she snarled in her face. But Hanako continued to struggle and scream. Her eyes were wild. And then Matsuda did what she had never allowed herself to do. She slapped her. A sharp, ringing slap. Hanako fell silent, shocked. A red mark bloomed on her cheek, covered in gray dust. "Form up," Matsuda commanded in an icy tone. The girls, frozen in horror at the sight of this scene, instinctively fell into line. Even Hanako, staggering, took her place in the ranks. She looked at Matsuda with hatred and fear. "Our city is destroyed. It's possible all our families are dead," Matsuda pronounced, enunciating every word. "We don't know what happened. We don't know if anyone else is alive. But we know one thing. We are a labor unit of a military factory. And until a different order is given, we will continue to perform our duties. Our duty now is to survive, in an organized manner, according to the charter. Any panic or breach of discipline will be treated as treason and punished with the full severity of wartime. Is that clear?" She surveyed them with a heavy gaze. They were silent. Fear and resentment could be read in their eyes, but also relief. She had taken control again. She had given them rules again, given them a system. A cruel, inhuman system, but an understandable one. The rebellion was crushed. But the price of this victory was high. At that moment, a moral schism occurred in their small community. Some, like Akiko, saw Matsuda's cruelty as the highest form of care. Others, like Hanako, saw in her a monster, a tyrant who had stolen even their right to grieve. They were still a single formation, but within that formation, a crack now lived. They looked at their savior, and in their eyes was no longer just fear and respect, but also a quiet, hidden hatred. The external order was restored, but an invisible war was already raging inside each of their bodies. The exit to the surface, however brief, had worsened their condition. They had inhaled a new dose of radioactive dust. Their skin had absorbed the poison dissolved in the air. The symptoms that had initially appeared only in Yuki began to manifest in others. Nausea, dizziness, weakness. The strange metallic taste in their mouths became their constant companion. But the most terrifying thing was not these physical ailments. The most terrifying thing was what was happening to their blood. Matsuda noticed it by accident. One of the girls cut her hand on the sharp edge of a can. The scratch was trivial, but the blood would not stop. It seeped and seeped, pale and thin, as if diluted with water. Others began to have nosebleeds that were impossible to stop. Small, crimson spots, subcutaneous hemorrhages, started appearing on their skin. Their bodies, their fortresses, were betraying them from within. The discipline and order that had worked so well against external threats, rubble, hunger, thirst, proved utterly useless against this invisible, internal enemy. There was no paragraph in the charter that could stop the disintegration of blood cells. The first aid kit, with its bandages and iodine, was a mockery of their suffering. Matsuda tried to fight this too. She took a medical brochure from the kit and tried to find a description of similar symptoms. But there was nothing like it. This was a disease that did not yet have a name. So she began to act by analogy. Weakness? That meant bed rest and increased nutrition. She ordered the strategic reserve of canned food to be opened and gave the most weakened girls a whole can per day. Nausea? That meant drinking more water. Bleeding? Apply tight bandages. These were desperate, blind attempts to apply order to something that did not submit to order. Little Yuki was the worst off. Her body, the weakest and youngest, was giving up the fastest. She was constantly vomiting. She couldn't eat. Her beautiful, long black hair began to fall out. She lay on a makeshift bed of burlap, and with each day, there was less and less life in her. The girls took turns caring for her, but their care was mechanical, like carrying out another task. They were afraid to look at her because in her fading eyes they saw their own future. On the 6th day, Yuki died. She died quietly, in her sleep. Her death did not cause wild sobbing. They had no tears left. There was only a dull, numb stupor. They looked at her small, emaciated body, and each thought the same thing. I'm next. But even here, Matsuda did not let them sink into despair. She did not allow death to destroy her order. Prepare the body for burial, she commanded, as if speaking of disposing of used material. She sent the 2 strongest girls to the surface to dig a grave. She ordered the others to wash Yuki's body and wrap it in a clean cloth they had found in the warehouse. It was a terrible, unbearable task, but they carried it out in silence. Their own grief, their fear, their pity, all were suppressed by Matsuda's iron will. The funeral was short and stark, like everything in their new life. They stood in formation around a shallow pit in the gray ash. Matsuda recited a few words from a Buddhist funeral prayer she remembered from childhood. Her voice was even and emotionless. She seemed untouched by the child's death. But as they began to fill the grave, Akiko noticed a single spare tear roll down the overseer's cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but Akiko saw it, and she understood. Matsuda was not a heartless monster. She was an actress, playing the role of an iron lady because she knew if she broke, they all would break. Her cruelty was her armor. Her discipline was her cross. Yuki's death was the point of no return for them. They realized that their underground fortress could not protect them from the main enemy. They were doomed. And yet by some strange, irrational inertia, they continued to live by the charter, continued to work in shifts, continued to form up for roll call, continued to keep track of canned goods. The ritual became more important than the meaning. It was the last straw they clung to keep from drowning in madness. They fought off death with a daily schedule. That evening, as one of the girls stood watch at the exit to the surface, peering into the lifeless, ashen landscape, she saw movement. Far on the horizon, among the ruins, a dark dot was moving. Then another, and another. They were people, emaciated, ghost-like. They were wandering through the dead city. Rescuers. Help had come. The girl on watch opened her mouth to shout for joy, to call the others, but not a sound escaped her throat. Instead, she turned and ran back into the basement, not to the girls, but to Matsuda, to report the change in the situation. According to the charter, the rescue was not like a scene from a heroic film. There were no tears of joy, no hugs, no shouts of "we're saved." There was bewilderment on both sides. The rescue squad, consisting of soldiers and volunteers, had been combing the ruins for several days, and what they had seen would have broken anyone. They found charred bodies, people with horrific burns dying in agony, those who had lost their minds from terror. They were used to the sight of suffering and chaos, and so, when they stumbled upon the ruins of the Mitsubishi factory and a neat line of 12 girls in torn but tidily tucked-in uniforms emerged from underground, they were dumbfounded. The girls stood straight, composed, their faces smeared with soot but showing no expression of panic or hysteria. There was only focused expectation. In front of them stood a woman with a stone face. She took a step forward and, enunciating her words clearly, reported, "Labor Mobilization Brigade, Assembly Workshop Number 3, 12 persons present. Losses, 12 persons. Ready for evacuation. Shift Supervisor Matsuda." The commander of the rescue squad, an old, tired lieutenant, looked at her, not believing his eyes. He had expected anything. Tears, fainting, incoherent babbling. But not this. Not a military report from a group of schoolgirls in the middle of an atomic wasteland. Are you all right? He stammered, not knowing what to say. We were following emergency survival procedures. There are wounded and weakened. Medical assistance and transport are required, Matsuda replied dryly. Her calmness, her businesslike manner seemed monstrous, unnatural in this setting. The girls were loaded into trucks and taken to an improvised hospital set up in a surviving school building on the outskirts of the city. And here, the clash of their small, orderly world with the mainland became even sharper. Hell reigned all around. The corridors were packed with groaning, dying people. Doctors and nurses, collapsing from exhaustion, couldn't keep up with the demand for help. Pain, filth, and despair were everywhere. And the factory girls sat in a neat row on the floor in a corner, silently waiting for their turn. They didn't cry, didn't complain, didn't demand attention. They were a strange, quiet island of order in a sea of chaos. And it was frightening. The doctors who examined them were amazed. Despite the symptoms of radiation sickness, their physical condition was significantly better than most other survivors found around the same time. They were not severely dehydrated or malnourished. Their wounds, though clumsily, had been cleaned and bandaged. Someone had taken care of them. Someone had organized their survival. News of the strange group of schoolgirls reached the military command in charge of the rescue operations. Matsuda was summoned for questioning. A young, ambitious captain from headquarters interrogated her. He didn't believe a single word she said. You claim that you and 12 underage girls survived in a collapsed basement for 7 days? Organizing a sort of military camp there? He asked with disbelief. We were following the charter, Matsuda replied without emotion. You established shifts? Rationed water and food? Conducted roll calls? Yes. And this slap? You admit to using violence against one of your charges? Hanako, broken and apathetic, had told them everything. It was a necessary measure to quell a panic that threatened the lives of the entire group. Matsuda answered, just as evenly. The captain looked at her and did not understand. In his worldview, heroes were supposed to be different. They were supposed to show compassion, humanity, support each other with kind words. But this woman spoke of brutal discipline, of punishments, of suppressing emotions. Her story was not heroic. It was wrong. It didn't fit into the framework of official propaganda about the nation's fortitude and unity in the face of the enemy. There was something cold, mechanical, inhuman about it. Something that inspired not admiration, but unease. Their story was an inconvenient truth. The truth that in hell, it is not the one who remains human who survives, but the one who becomes a machine. That salvation can come not from love, but from a soulless regulation. This undermined everything. A few days later, Matsuda was informed of the decision. Your experience is recognized as unique, but atypical. Its dissemination could be misinterpreted and cause unhealthy sentiments in society. You and your charges are advised to forget what happened in that basement, for the greater good. It was the final, most cruel blow. Their survival, their feat, their small empire of order, all of it was declared non-existent. Their story was not just forgotten. It was deliberately erased. Their rescue turned into a new prison, a prison of silence. They were not defeated by the atomic bomb or by radiation. They were defeated by the system, which had no use for their feet. The fates of the factory girls varied, but an invisible shadow of those 7 days spent underground lay upon each of their lives. They became hibakusha, people who had survived the atomic bombing. This stigma separated them from the rest of the world. They were feared, shunned, believed to be contagious. But there was another internal mark, invisible to outsiders. The mark of the cold, inhuman efficiency that had helped them survive but had killed the children within them. They were never able to fully return to the world of normal human emotions. Overseer Matsuda was quietly removed from any work involving people. She was deemed professionally deformed. She worked until the end of her days in an archive, sorting papers. She lived alone, in a small apartment on the outskirts of the rebuilt Hiroshima. No one ever saw her smile or cry. She became a quiet, withered shadow. The girls from her brigade tried not to see her or each other. Their shared past was too heavy a burden, one that each preferred to carry alone. Akiko, the girl who knew all the instructions by heart, found her calling in accounting. She became an excellent bookkeeper. The world of numbers, where everything was precise, logical, and followed rules, became her refuge from the chaos of memories. She married an equally quiet and meticulous man, had children, but even in her motherly love, there was always an element of strict accountability. She never raised her voice at her children, but demanded they follow the daily schedule without question. Emmy, the pragmatic and sensible one, became a civil engineer. She rebuilt the destroyed city. Every new house, every bridge was a personal victory over destruction for her. She was a good specialist, valued for her cold, analytical mind, but her colleagues feared her for her directness and complete lack of sentimentality. She learned how to build buildings, but never learned how to build close relationships with people. The fate of Hanako, the dreamer, was the most tragic. Her psyche never recovered from the shock. She often fell into long depressions, sometimes laughing for no reason, sometimes crying for days. She attempted suicide several times. Her life became a series of hospitals and medications. In her rare moments of lucidity, she wrote poetry. Strange, dark, but brilliant poems about gray ash and shadows on the walls. They were never published. The other girls lived quiet, unremarkable lives. They became housewives, shopkeepers, seamstresses. They tried to forget, but the past would not let go. They had nightmares of darkness and dust. They flinched at any loud noise, and all of them for the rest of their lives felt an irrational fear of basements. They never spoke of what had happened. To their children and grandchildren, they told the standard hibakusha story of the flesh, the fires, the sickness, but of the 7 days underground, of the empire of order built on the ruins of the world, not a word. It was their shared secret, their shared curse. Matsuda died in old age, completely alone. When social workers entered her apartment, they were stunned by the perfect order that reigned there. Every object was in its place. On the bedside table stood a framed photograph of 24 girls in school uniforms taken before the war. And clutched in her withered, clenched hand was an old, tarnished metal whistle. She was buried in a public cemetery without special honors. No one visited her grave. But, as the old cemetery workers told it, sometimes in the dead of night, especially on August days, it seemed a faint, shrill sound could be heard over her grave. The sound of a factory whistle calling the dead to a final roll call. The official history of Hiroshima is a story of suffering and chaos, a story of the courage of doctors, the resilience of survivors, of mercy and mutual aid. In these chronicles, there is no place for the tale of 12 schoolgirls who survived not because of their humanity, but in spite of it. Their fate, cold and inconvenient, was buried in archives under the classification atypical case. It did not fit into the grand picture of national tragedy. But history has a strange quality. What is erased from official documents often sprouts up elsewhere. In folklore, in whispers, in legends. Years passed. The city was completely rebuilt from the ashes. New generations grew up, for whom the war was already a distant past. And among the children of the new Hiroshima, a strange urban legend began to circulate. It was said that if you went to the ruins of the old industrial district early in the morning on the anniversary of the bombing, you could see ghosts. But these were not ordinary ghosts, not moaning and frightening ones. They were the ghosts of girls in old school uniforms. They did not cry or complain. They marched silently, in a neat formation, among the ruins. and ahead of them walked the stern, ramrod-straight shadow of a woman, and a barely audible sound of a whistle could be heard in the air. The legend said that these were the factory spirits, who had still not received the order to end their shift and were doomed to eternally keep their watch in the dead city. They became a kind of guardian of this cursed place, a symbol not of suffering but of an unbending, frightening order. No one knew where this story came from. Perhaps it was born from the vague, fragmented memories of the rescuers. Perhaps one of the surviving girls, in a delirium, had let slip what happened to them. Or perhaps the very memory of this place, the very earth, saturated with pain and discipline, gave birth to this phantom. Thus, a real story of survival turned into a myth. A myth about how a system, created for war and production, at a critical moment, turned out to be the only tool for salvation from total collapse. About how sometimes, to save human lives, one must sacrifice humanity, and about how the price of such survival can be more terrifying than death itself. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten feat. It is a reminder that man's most powerful weapon is his ability to create order out of chaos. But this same weapon, taken to its absolute, can turn him into a soulless mechanism. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? There is no universal answer. They survived, they preserved their bodies at the cost of their souls. And their story, which became a legend of ghosts marching in the ash, will forever remain a silent question addressed to each of us. Where is the line at which order ceases to save and begins to kill? And what in fact is more terrifying? To perish in chaos, or to survive in a perfect but soulless order?